Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we cut through the noise and deliver the essential knowledge you need to be truly well-informed. Today, we're taking a deep plunge into project estimating and cost management. Now, before you think this is just for the project managers out there, I want you to consider this. Whether you're building a new app, planning a charity gala, or even just tackling that long-awaited kitchen renovation, understanding how complex endeavors actually get off the ground, how costs are determined, and why things so often veer off track is absolutely indispensable. Our sources for this deep dive are a really comprehensive guide to these fundamentals, offering you, a significant shortcut to mastery.
And a shortcut it certainly is. Because while project estimating and cost management might sound like purely technical number crunching processes, they are in fact a fascinating blend of art and science, often deeply misunderstood. Our mission today is to, well, demystify these core concepts for you, reveal the surprising, often counterintuitive factors that truly impact project success and cost, and provide insights that will empower you to navigate any complex situation, from that kitchen remodel to a multi-million-dollar business initiative with far greater confidence and foresight.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Before we even think about putting a price tag on anything, our sources immediately dive into two absolutely critical foundational structures: the work to breakdown structure, or WBS, and the resource breakdown structure, RBS. What exactly are these, and why are they so fundamental to any project?
Well, what's fascinating here is that these aren't just, bureaucratic tools. They're the foundational blueprints, the very DNA of a project. The work breakdown structure, the WBS, is essentially a uniform, consistent, and logical method for dividing a project into smaller, more manageable components. Its primary purpose is to provide a common reference framework for everyone involved, which then drastically facilitates the integration of all your project plans for time, resources, even quality. And critically, it minimizes omissions, making sure you don't overlook key elements, and it simplifies the entire project by breaking it down into digestible, actionable units.
Okay, that sounds like creating an incredibly detailed, almost surgical outline for everything that needs to be done. What's the biggest mistake people make when they don't create a WBS, or maybe they create a poor one?
Oh, the biggest mistake, and it's a common one, is forgetting something crucial or having different teams working at cross purposes because there's no shared map, no common understanding. Our sources really emphasize a deliverable oriented approach as the most useful for the upper levels of the WBS.
Deliverable-oriented.
Yeah.
So focusing on what you actually hand over.
Exactly. This means you divide the project by what you're actually delivering. A tangible product, a functional system, or maybe a physical area. Like, for instance, imagine building an industrial complex. Your top-level WBS might logically divide it into powerhouse, factory, office, and grounds. Pretty clear buckets. Then each of those gets broken down further. The powerhouse could have steam generation system and electrical generation system.
Hmm,
The office might break down into first floor and second floor, you see.
right. Tangible sections or outcomes.
Precisely. Now, while the lowest levels of any WBS will always be activity-based, the actual tasks people do, the goal is to remain deliverable-oriented as high up in the structure as possible. Makes it easier to track progress against outcomes. Although it's worth noting that some projects, like, say, process-oriented ones, like the ongoing operation of a refinery, might naturally become activity-based earlier in their WBS. Developing a good WBS involves grouping elements, usually into 3 to 9 categories per level, keeping a consistent basis for division at each step, and making sure you have similar detail at the lowest level elements. Consistency is key.
Okay, so that's the work. What about the RBS?
Right. Complementing the WBS is the resource breakdown structure, or RBS. If the WBS defines what you're building, the RBS is a comprehensive classification and catalog of all the resources needed to achieve those project objectives. And I mean all resources. We're talking labor, equipment, necessary licenses, even things like taxes, basically. Anything that costs money or gets consumed.
So everything you need to do the work defined in the WBS.
Exactly. And the benefits are significant. It gives you greater assurance of resource data reliability, helps you capitalize on organizational memory by tracking what resources were used before, and it significantly facilitates accurate resource assignments and scheduling down the line.
So, if the WBS is your project's skeleton, the RBS feels like its entire circulatory system defining all the blood, nutrients, and energy needed to bring it to life. So for someone doing, say, a home renovation, their RBS wouldn't just be labor and materials, would it? They'd be thinking about specific contractors, rented tools, maybe permits.
Precisely. For your kitchen renovation, you might not have chemists in your RBS, hopefully not, but you will have electricians, plumbers, and cabinet installers, or even friends who owe you a favor if you're doing some DIY. The principle of categorizing by skill, role, or type of resource, making sure you know exactly who or what does what and where, is exactly the same, whether it's a huge industrial complex or your home reno. And it's typically far more efficient to adapt an existing RBS for a family of similar projects rather than starting from scratch every single time. When it comes to human resources within an RBS, you might divide them by administrative affiliations like Company A or Contractor X, or perhaps by physical location like Los Angeles team versus Boston team. Other common ways: credential or discipline, think licensed electricians or professional engineers. Work function, like programmers versus designers. Position title, department chiefs, or even skill level, like expert versus semi-skilled. Lots of options depending on the project.
It's clear these structures aren't just about organizing tasks. They truly serve as the common skeleton for all project planning, estimating, and communication. It's not just the blueprint, it's the blueprint and the inventory list. Okay, now that we've seen the scaffolding that hold the project together, the crucial, often nail-biting question emerges. How do you actually put a price tag and a timeline on all that? Because as our sources reveal, those initial cost and duration predictions can be astonishingly off the mark. Let's dive into the fascinating and sometimes frustrating art of project estimating.
It really is fascinating. Predicting cost and duration is this blend of art and science, you know? You're using historical data, personal expertise, institutional memory, the project scope, trying to predict resource needs, total cost, and how long it'll take. And here's the absolute shocker, what our sources call the accuracy paradox. Early estimates, though absolutely essential for getting project authorization, for getting things off the ground, they are often extremely inaccurate, just wildly off.
How inaccurate are we talking?
Well, this is due to limited information early on and a high probability of unexpected, usually undesirable events. To give you a sense of just how inaccurate, initial estimates can degrade to 233% inaccuracy, meaning the actual cost could range from 33% to 333% of that early estimate.
Whoa.
Yeah, compare that to later estimates when things are clearer, which can be around 3-4% accurate. Big difference.
That's a massive, almost terrifying difference. The shocking insight here isn't just that early estimates are inaccurate, but that major strategic decisions, potentially risking millions, are routinely made on data that could be off by 233%. It reveals this critical paradox.
Yeah.
You must estimate early for approval, but you absolutely cannot trust those numbers for execution. So if they're so wildly off early on, why even bother?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? You have to start somewhere. You need some basis, however flawed, to make an informed decision to greenlight the project at all. The key is striking a balance. You need to spend enough time on estimating to get the required accuracy for that stage of the project. Always remembering that preliminary estimates are a kind of necessary evil, even when you've only got sketchy data.
Okay, so how do managers actually do the estimating? What are the techniques?
Right. When it comes to the techniques, project managers use various estimating models. You've got general purpose models that use mathematical expressions and assumptions to predict costs, duration, resource demands. Their success really relies heavily on the project manager's experience and, crucially, having reliable historical data to feed them. Garbage in, garbage out.
Makes sense. What about more specific methods?
Then you have specific techniques that get more granular. Analogous estimating, sometimes called conceptual or order of magnitude estimating, basically uses historical data from similar past projects. It's quick, gives you that ballpark figure, but it's not highly accurate, typically used for those very early, rough estimates. Moving up in precision, you have parametric estimating. This uses models with multiple inputs or parameters.
Like what sort of inputs?
Well, for a software project, inputs might include things like system complexity, the size of the code base, maybe the skill level of the manpower involved. For a construction project, it could be the industry type, the capacity of the plant, or the project's location. Different factors drive cost in different fields. And even simpler, there's ratio estimating, which is based on assuming a linear relationship between cost or duration and some basic features of the project.
Okay, so beyond these general models, our sources highlight these clever rules of thumb that give you a quick, albeit rough, estimate. It makes me think about those times when you try to scale up a recipe in the kitchen and it just doesn't quite work out proportionally. Is there a common pitfall people fall into when applying these rules in the real world?
That's a great analogy. And yes, the common pitfall is treating them as absolute laws rather than guidelines, or applying them to situations where the underlying assumptions just don't hold true. For instance, take the three-quarters rule, CP/SPSC 0.75. This helps estimate the cost of a new project, CPSC, based on an existing one, CT, and their respective sizes, CP and C.
Okay, walk me through that with an example.
Sure. Let's say a three-bedroom house costs, I don't know, $37,500 to build. Using this rule, a five-bedroom house would be estimated at around $55,000 and a six-bedroom house at about $63,000. You can even apply this graphically on a log-log scale. The reason for that 0.75 exponent, by the way, is that costs for larger items often don't scale perfectly linearly. There are economies of scale, sure, but also increased complexity.
Interesting. So costs go up, but not quite one-to-one with size.
Exactly. And if you're trying to figure out how long a larger project might take based on a smaller one, you might use the square root rule, TQP-ET, CTC-E 0.5. This relates duration, T, to cost C. So if a 200-room dormitory costing $10.4 million took 12 months, a 340-room dorm at $14.8 million would be estimated, using this rule, to take about 14.3 months.
And you turned to one for building multiple things at once.
Right, for those large-scale efforts where you're building multiple similar components concurrently, like several apartment blocks at the same time, there's the two-thirds rule, TP-NPE, NPNE 0.66, where N is the number of concurrent subsystems. This gives surprising insights into how duration scales. It often applies when you have parallel teams kind of gaining efficiency on repetitive but simultaneous tasks.
Okay, one more estimating technique you mentioned was about dealing with optimism.
Ah, yes, range estimating. This is a really powerful technique to counter our natural human optimism, especially when predicting how long something will take or how much it will cost. Instead of landing on a single number, you provide three: an optimistic value, best case, a most likely value, and a pessimistic value, worst case. Then you use a formula for the most likely estimate, often called the expected time, or TE. It's 2 plus 4TM plus TP6. Notice how the most likely value is weighted 4 times more.
Why is that?
Because it reflects reality, the most likely scenario is the most probable. But the fascinating insight here is that this weighted average accounts for the higher probability, or at least the higher impact, of things going wrong. The tail risk. So if your optimistic, most likely, and pessimistic values are, say, 5 days, 8 days, and 35 days respectively, the model's most likely estimate, the TE, comes out to 12 days, which is notably higher than the simple most likely guess of 8.
Because it factors in that chance of the 35-day disaster scenario.
This method acknowledges the uncertainty and our inherent biases, giving you a far more realistic expectation.
Knowing these models really helps you understand how estimates are formed, their inherent limitations, and critically, what probing questions to ask when someone presents you with a project plan. It's about seeing beyond that single number and appreciating the assumptions and maybe the potential biases baked right into it. Okay, so once that initial estimate is made, however accurate or inaccurate it might be, the real world inevitably intervenes. Projects are rarely static. So the big question becomes, how do organizations monitor progress effectively, manage the inevitable changes, and account for risks, all without completely overwhelming everyone involved?
Right. This is where the rubber really meets the road, isn't it? Where good planning transitions into effective execution and control. Progress monitoring is absolutely essential, not just for keeping the project manager informed day to day, but critically for collecting that valuable historical data that will refine future estimates, making you better next time. And it's distinct from traditional cost accounting because it focuses specifically on deliverable-specific resource expenditure, how much effort went into this specific part of the WBS rather than just tracking broad budget categories.
So it's more granular, tied directly to the project structure.
Precisely. And an effective organizational project management culture really needs 3 things to make this work well. First, a strong commitment to principles, like having a formal scope definition and diligently using that WBS and RBS we talked about. Second, consistent procedures for things like approvals, mobilization, reporting. Everyone needs to know the process. And third, the right operational tools, data capture forms, project management software, things that make tracking easier.
And I imagine the level of detail in that reporting matters immensely, right? You don't want to drown the CEO in the same minutia that a software developer needs to do their job.
Absolutely. Tailored reporting is key. Project staff, they need all the details for their tasks, and maybe interdependent tasks, they need the weeds. But a CEO, they might only receive a 1 or 2 line report summarizing the overall cost and schedule status. Green, yellow, red kind of thing.
Right, just the bottom line.
It's about delivering the right information to the right person at the right time. And importantly, the frequency of data collection and the acceptable tolerances for variances. How far off can we be before raising a flag? Those must be agreed upon by all parties beforehand. Prevents inefficiency and micromanagement.
Okay, but how do you measure progress for tasks that aren't easy to count? Like designing something creative.
That's a great question. For some tasks, you have direct indicators, right? feet of wire pulled, lines of code written, bricks laid. Easy. But for more creative or hard-to-measure tasks like designing a logo or writing a complex report, different crediting methods come into play. These are quite interesting. You've got the 0%, 100% rule. You get 0 credit until the task is completely finished, then 100%. Very simple, maybe a bit harsh. Or the 20%, 80% rule, where you credit 20% just for starting the task, and the remaining 80% comes only upon full delivery.
A bit more encouraging to get started.
Kind of. Then there's the 50% rule, half for starting, half on delivery. Seems fair. And even a more granular one, the 30%, 40% rule. Here you get 0% if it's not started, 30% when it's just started, 60% when it's actively in progress, and the full 100% when completed.
So different ways to represent progress subjectively.
Exactly. And while these might seem a bit imprecise at the individual task level, when you roll them up across the entire project, they tend to provide an acceptable level of accuracy for the overall project progress. Gives you a reasonable snapshot.
And that's where earned value comes in, isn't it? That sounds like the ultimate progress report, combining cost and schedule.
It really is. Earned Value Management, or EVM, is a very powerful tool. It measures progress objectively and helps determine payment, especially in fixed-price contracts where you pay based on milestones achieved. Even for internal projects, it helps assess the actual rate of progress toward goals by summarizing what value has been earned for the effort expended, all mapped back to the WBS structure. It gives you a clear, objective picture. Here's what we plan to have done and spent, and here's what we actually have done and spent. Are we ahead or behind, over or under budget?
Very powerful indeed. What else impacts costs once you're underway?
Well, productivity is another major factor in cost management, and it's affected by all sorts of things. Team characteristics like pride, competency, cohesion, also the clarity of the project plan, the availability of the right tools, how frequently changes are hitting the team, whether there's a formalized scope change policy, even the type of contract can influence behavior. And for highly repetitive tasks, our sources highlight the learning curve concept. This isn't just theory, it's observable.
The idea that you get faster as you repeat something.
Exactly. But it's more than just getting faster. It's about optimizing the process. Think about tying your shoelaces. The first time was probably awkward, slow, but after hundreds of repetitions, you do it almost automatically, super efficiently. The learning curve tells us that as teams repeat similar tasks, they discover efficiencies, they reduce mistakes, they streamline their workflow, and all that leads to tangible cost and time savings. It's why specialists often get tasks done faster and cheaper than generalists. For instance, maybe designing a first web page takes 120 minutes, but by the time you're doing the 30th similar page, it might only take 100 minutes. That's the learning curve in action.
Okay, so you're tracking progress, managing productivity.
Mm-hmm.
But what about changes? They always happen.
Always. And that's why a formal cost management system is crucial. It integrates the estimating we talked about, the budgeting, and critically, the process for managing changes. Key components usually include a change management board, sometimes called a change control board or CCB. They review proposed changes from a project management and client expectation standpoint.
So they're asking about the impact on schedule, budget, scope.
Precisely. They're focused on the business impact of a change. Does this blow our budget? Does it delay our launch date? Does it upset the client or require contract modification? Then, often distinct from that, there's the configuration management board. They monitor and document the technical characteristics of the deliverable, the product itself, and manage changes from a technical standpoint.
Ah, so they're the guardians of the technical integrity.
You got it. They're asking, does this proposed change break the system? Does it negatively affect performance? Does it create technical debt we'll regret later? Does it mess up the input-output structure or system complexity? One board focuses on project delivery constraints, the other on technical product integrity. Both rely heavily on formal change request forms and change logs to maintain meticulously documented records of every proposed and approved change. Audit trails are vital.
It makes complete sense that making changes early is far easier and cheaper. I imagine the cost of change just skyrockets the further into a project you get.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. Modifying project plans early, during design or planning. Minimal impact, usually. But the cost of making changes increases substantially, often exponentially, as the project progresses towards completion. Changing the foundation is much harder than changing the paint color. This also ties directly into the impact of schedule on cost. If you need to shorten the project duration, what we call project compression, it almost always incurs a significant cost penalty. There's rarely a free lunch when rushing.
How do teams try to speed things up?
Well, techniques like fast tracking or concurrent engineering or in software, rapid application development,
Yeah.
they all try to speed things up by overlapping phases that would normally happen in sequence. Like starting construction before the architectural design is 100% finalized, or developing software modules while the requirements are still being fully defined.
Sounds risky.
It absolutely is. This approach can sometimes minimize errors if managed well, but it carries inherent, often substantial risks if things go wrong. If you built foundations based on an early design that later changes significantly, well, that's expensive rework.
What about just throwing more people at the problem?
That's another common tactic. Compressing the critical path by adding more resources, more shifts, larger crew sizes, more programmers. But remember that powerful rule of thumb we discussed earlier. Halving the duration can often double the effort or cost.
Right, the nonlinear relationship.
Exactly. And the real insight here is why this happens. You're not just adding people linearly, you're massively increasing communication overhead, coordination challenges, creating potential new bottlenecks, and often incurring costs like overtime premiums, or maybe even quality sacrifices to meet the deadline. It's the law of diminishing returns kicking in hard. Think about that database coding task example. 5 programmers working for 6 days is 30 worker days of effort. But if you need it done in 3 days, you might need 20 programmers, which totals 60 worker days for the exact same coding task. Double the effort for half the time.
Wow.
It highlights the often brutal trade-offs involved. Delivering early can mean making sacrifices in cost, quality, or even scope. Maybe the software gets delivered faster, but with more bugs, requiring more user training and post-launch debugging. That's why lifecycle cost analysis, looking at the total cost over the project's entire lifespan, including maintenance and support, is so crucial when making these scheduled
And
decisions.
what about just planning for things going wrong? Risk.
Absolutely essential. Project risk management is all about proactive planning for those possible occurrences, the what-ifs that could negatively impact scope, quality, cost, or schedule. This isn't just worrying, it's structured. It can involve identifying risks, assessing their probability and impact, and then developing mitigation plans. Sometimes it even involves calculating a statistical monetary value for each identified risk, multiplying the probability of it happening by the estimated cost impact if it does, to justify setting aside appropriate contingency funds or reserves in the budget. Plan for the bumps in the road.
It's crystal clear that managing projects is this continuous dynamic dance between the initial plans and the unfolding, often messy reality. Understanding these sophisticated mechanisms for monitoring progress, controlling costs, and adapting to change is absolutely key to navigating that dance effectively and hopefully staying on budget and on time. Now let's shift gears slightly. What happens when an organization decides not to do the project internally, but to outsource or contract it out? How do external projects, with their unique dynamics and contract types, fit into this complex world of estimating and cost management?
That's a really important area. Organizations outsource for several strategic reasons, right? Maybe to access specialized skills or equipment they don't have in-house, or to gain specific expertise quickly. Sometimes it's even part of a larger effort towards cultural transformation, or simply because of perceived cost savings, though that perception isn't always reality.
Are there downsides to outsourcing?
Oh, definitely. A significant potential disadvantage, our sources point out, is the lack of building institutional memory. When crucial project knowledge resides primarily with an external entity, the internal team doesn't learn as much. This can potentially lead to future dependence and needing to outsource again for similar work because the internal team hasn't built up that specific expertise.
Okay, so when you do go external, what becomes really critical?
In external projects, the specifications become incredibly fundamentally crucial. They meticulously define the scope and objectives. What exactly is the contractor supposed to deliver? And it's vital here to quantify those fuzzy deliverable qualifiers like user-friendly or robust. What does user-friendly actually mean in measurable terms? How will we test for robustness?
Because if you don't define it,
If you don't define it clearly, you often see scope creep. We mentioned it before, but it's especially prevalent in external projects. It's that continuous, gradual shifting of the project's baseline scope due to undocumented or unmanaged changes. This is particularly common in certain contract types, like cost-plus contracts we'll discuss, or projects that start with fuzzy objectives that weren't really nailed down properly at the start.
so the contract itself is key. What types are there?
Absolutely. The legal backbone of any external project is the contract. It's that binding agreement to acquire products or services. Our sources detail a few key types. First, you have the lump sum or fixed price contract. This type requires highly detailed, unambiguous specifications right up front before you sign. The contractor analyzes those specs, estimates their cost, adds profit, and gives you a single fixed price. They guarantee that price and assume essentially all the financial risk if their estimate was wrong or things go sideways.
Sounds good for the client cost certainty.
It offers the client cost certainty if, and it's a big if, the scope remains absolutely rigidly stable throughout the project. But if the scope does need to change, even slightly, the renegotiations for those changes can become, as our sources put it, potentially explosive for both parties. The contractor holds a lot of leverage once work has started.
Okay, so high certainty for the client, but high risk for the contractor, and very inflexible if scope changes. What's the alternative when you expect things might evolve or the scope isn't perfectly defined yet?
Right. The main alternative is the cost plus fixed fee contract, often just called time and material, T&M, although there are variations. Here, the contractor's profit is generally protected. They are reimbursed for all their allowable costs, labor hours, materials, etc. Plus, they get a pre-agreed fixed fee, or sometimes a percentage of costs, as their profit. The client, in turn, has much more freedom and flexibility to modify the scope as the project evolves. That's why this type is popular for R&D, exploratory work, or highly uncertain projects where the end goal isn't perfectly clear at the outset.
But what's the downside for the client here?
The big downside is that the initial project cost estimate effectively becomes a vague target rather than a firm commitment. The total cost is unknown until the end. And, arguably, the contractor has less inherent financial incentive for maximum productivity or cost control because their costs are covered regardless. Their incentive might be more aligned with logging hours. Sometimes, a contractor is even hired first under a T&M contract just to help develop the detailed specifications needed for a future fixed price bid.
Interesting. Are there any other main types?
There's also a common hybrid called the unit price contract. Here, there's a fixed price agreed upon, but it's for small, well-defined elements or units of work. Think price per line of code written in software development, or price per cubic yard of concrete poured in construction. The contractor gets paid based on the number of these units actually delivered or used. This offers some cost predictability per unit, but allows for flexibility in the total quantity needed for the project.
That makes sense for work where the unit is clear but the total volume is uncertain.
Exactly. What's also fascinating, according to our sources, is the ideal response to specifications from contractors when they're bidding on work. Ideally, they shouldn't just passively accept the specs and promise to comply. A truly collaborative contractor should actively ask clarifying questions if there's ambiguity. They should list out their key assumptions if the specs seem incomplete. They should take formal exceptions if they believe an objective is technically unattainable or unrealistic, and maybe even make proactive suggestions for improvements or alternative approaches that could be better or cheaper.
That sounds like fostering a real partnership rather than just a transaction.
It absolutely fosters partnership, though admittedly it can sometimes conflict with a contractor's perceived short-term interest, which might be to simply agree to vague specs and then profit from the inevitable change orders later on.
Yeah. Let's talk cost definitions too. Are costs...
The categories are generally similar, but the implications can differ. You have direct costs, those directly traceable to specific deliverable components in the WBS. Think personnel hours and equipment time spent directly working on building the product or service. Then you have indirect costs. These are costs necessary for overall project success, but are more removed or shared across multiple projects. Things like senior management compensation, general corporate marketing efforts, maybe even the costs sunk into unsuccessful proposals for other projects. These are often subject to debate and allocation formulas.
And overhead.
Overhead is very similar to indirect costs, often used interchangeably, but typically refers more to the general support infrastructure, office space, utilities, IT services, HR department, etc. that supports all projects. Now, the important thing to note is that when comparing the cost of doing a project internally versus outsourcing it, an internal project's real cost should also fairly consider its allocated share of these indirect costs and overhead for a true apples-to-apples comparison with a contractor's bid, which inherently includes their own overhead and profit.
Right. You need the full picture. And finally, what about when things go really south? When a project just needs to be pulled back or canceled? Is that different for internal versus external?
Oh, vastly different. Terminating an internal project, while potentially painful politically or strategically, is relatively straightforward logistically. Personnel and equipment can typically be reassigned to other tasks within the organization. However, terminating an external project, especially if the contractor is performing satisfactorily according to the contract terms, but the client's needs have simply changed, that is far more complex and costly. It almost always involves extensive, often difficult negotiations to fairly compensate the contractor. You have to pay for all the work completed to date, often for work currently in progress, potentially for materials already purchased. Plus, you might have to cover the contractor's mobilization and demobilization costs, and potentially even a portion of the anticipated profits they would have made on the remainder of the canceled contract. It's rarely a clean or cheap break.
Wow. Understanding these different contract types, the cost structures, and the unique dynamics of external projects is absolutely critical then. For anyone involved in procuring services or delivering them, making sure expectations are aligned from the very start seems paramount to preventing those costly surprises and disputes down the line. We've covered a tremendous amount today. We've moved all the way from the foundational structures of WBS and RBS through the intricate, sometimes tricky world of estimating models and the accuracy paradox, then into the dynamic process of monitoring costs and managing inevitable change, and finally exploring the unique considerations of external projects and contracts. It's truly a blend of art, human psychology and rigorous science, always evolving.
Ultimately, knowing how projects are estimated, how they're actually built and executed, and how they're managed through their entire life cycle gives you, the listener, a really powerful lens, a way to see beyond the surface of almost any endeavor. It's not just about crunching numbers, is it? It's about strategically navigating complexity, understanding and mitigating risk, and fostering clear, unambiguous communication. And this, I think, raises an important question for you to ponder. How will applying this holistic view from that initial, often wildly inaccurate estimate all the way through to the final delivery and even beyond, how will that transform the way you approach your next big challenge? Whether that's a personal goal you've set or a major professional venture you're involved in.
Yeah, what stood out to you from this deep dive? We'd love for you to consider how these insights, maybe about WBS or range estimating or the cost of change, can be applied to projects you're working on right now, or perhaps simply those you're curious about out there in the world around you.